to look at what we call the functions. And before we formally introduce what a function is, we want to have this casual understanding of what function does and why we care about functions. And that's what we're going to start with. And for functions in this module, we're going to introduce a variety of different ways that we can represent a function. And the first type of way to represent a function is what we say as verbal representation. And in a verbal representation, it kind of resembles what we use as a daily conversation language to describe what exactly the function does. And what that means is that in this particular worksheet or this particular video, you're going to see a lot of examples with paragraphs describing what exactly the function is doing. And for that purpose, I might recommend you to pause the video to read the question on your own before you continue the video, where we walk through the solutions for example problems and now you try problems. So you might want to take some time to read the question first. So take your time to read it before you continue with example 1, for instance. And in example 1, we have this vending machine that's set up that you can essentially press different buttons and end up getting different candy bars as a result. And that should be a brief summary of what you would get by reading the question. And with this scenario, the first type of information we want to deal with when we look at a function is we want to consider what are the inputs and what are the outputs for our function. In this case, the function is going through this machine. So we want to think about what are the inputs and outputs for the machine. And inputs and outputs in general, just like what the words sound like, in is something that you put into the machine, it's some information you give the machine. And output is what the machine spits out, and that's essentially the end result of what you get. And if we look at this vending machine scenario, the information you give the machine is through pressing the different buttons, and because of that, whatever button you're pressing, that's going to be the input for our machine over here. On the other hand, for the output, that's what the machine spits out, and that's essentially what the function spits out as well. That's why we call it the output. And in this case, we would actually have the results of different candy bars spitting out over here. And now if we look at the type of inputs we can give the machine, the information we can provide. In this case, we have the different buttons, and in particular we can say they are the button A1, A2, A3, and it could be B1, B2, B3, and lastly we can have C1 through C4 being the different inputs over here. So the inputs in this particular information is the different buttons that we're pressing over here. That's how we give inputs to the machine, to the function over here. And on the other hand, what the machine spits out in return are the candy bars. So we can see that there are Skittles if we press A1, Snickers, and then we have Butterfingers, Milk Duds, M&Ms, and Snickers, Spearmint Gum, Altoids, and Mentos. Then you have Cinnamon Trident Gum over here. So what I circled would be what the machine could possibly spits out, and that collection of all the possible output over here are the things we want to list under part B to answer what are the outputs for the machine. So I'm going to take a minute to write down all these outputs while you do that as well. And as you're writing out all the possible outcomes over here, you might have noticed even in the parentheses we talk about Snickers are in 2 different locations. So you can press 2 different buttons and get the same result of Snickers. And in this case, you might wonder, do I want to list Snickers twice? And because we're just talking about what possible outcomes are, we are just going to list Snickers as one of the possible outcomes. Once that's listed, we don't have to repeat it. Even if there are 2 ways you can get the same candy bar, we only need to list it once, just to show that we consider that's a possible outcome already. So after that, we can keep listing the outcomes over here. So once you finish listing out all the possible candy options you can get out of the machine, these are the outputs of the machine. And then we want to think about whether there are any repeated inputs or outputs. And as we go through these, if we just look at the possible inputs, we can see that none of them repeated as we go through the process. But in terms of the outcomes, we already mentioned Snickers are in two different locations over here. And because of that, we say there is a repeated outcome with Snickers over here. And therefore, we can say there's no repeated inputs. But Snickers is repeated as the output over here. And that's how we can answer the questions about inputs and output. And now moving on to part D, we're asking what do you have to press in order to get Altoids? And that's essentially asking what does the machine do? How does the machine function specifically if you want to get Altoids? And reading back to the question, we see that if you press C2, you will get Altoids over here. And similarly, what do you need to press in order to get a Snickers? And Snickers, we already talked about, is a special case where you can get Snickers by pressing A2, or alternatively, we can get it by pressing B3. We can get it in two different locations over here. And next, for part F, what will you get if we press C4? That's where we're given the input of C4 and we want to look for what output it is, and we see that's cinnamon trident gum over here. Lastly, what would you get if you press B2? And it says if you press B2, you will get M&Ms over here. And that's how we can use the description in a verbal way to find out what exactly this machine does, what exactly this function does over here.